For most of Earth's history, you were safe. Not because you were strong and not because you were fast, but because nothing could see you. The oceans were already full of life, yet that life moved slowly, almost carelessly, drifting across the seafloor in a world that had never learned how to look. There were no eyes waiting in the distance, no awareness watching from the dark, no moment where you suddenly realized that something had locked onto you. You never saw it coming, and in a strange way, that made the world feel quiet, almost peaceful, because survival at that time was not a game of anticipation. It was not about reacting before danger arrived. It was simply existing, moment to moment, until something ended it. There was no chase, no strategy, no hunter calculating distance or timing, just life, unfolding slowly, in a system that had never needed fear. But that silence did not last. Somewhere in the vast darkness of the ancient ocean, something changed. Not a creature, not a predator, not a sudden leap in complexity, just a small cluster of cells, sensitive to light. It wasn't an eye, not even close. It could not form shapes, could not recognize distance, could not understand what it was detecting. It could only sense the faint difference between brightness and shadow. And yet, that tiny difference introduced something the world had never contained before. A warning. At first, it meant almost nothing. It didn't make you faster, it didn't make you stronger, it didn't even tell you what you were facing. But it gave you one advantage that no other organism had ever possessed: the ability to detect change before it touched you. And in evolution, that is everything. Because the moment you can sense something approaching, even imperfectly, you gain a choice: to move or to remain, to withdraw or to stay exposed, to survive or to disappear. That small advantage did not stay small for long. Across different branches of life, separated by time and distance, nature kept arriving at the same solution. Again and again, it built structures that could interact with light. Simple at first, then gradually more complex, more precise, more useful. It was not a single invention, but a pattern, repeating itself across the tree of life, as if the environment itself was pushing organisms toward the same inevitable conclusion. Seeing mattered, and as that ability improved, something else began to change. The world became less safe. At some point, one of those early systems crossed an invisible threshold. It no longer simply reacted to light. It began to form a crude image, a rough distinction between shapes, a faint awareness that something existed at a distance. Not just brightness, but presence. And that was enough. Because for the first time in the history of life, an organism could do more than respond. It could track, it could adjust, it could move with purpose toward something it had already detected, toward you. You were no longer just part of the environment. You were no longer invisible. You had become something that could be identified, followed, and chosen. And the most unsettling part is that you wouldn't have known it, because while one organism had learned to see, almost everything else was still blind. Imagine drifting slowly across the ocean floor, unaware of anything beyond immediate contact. No sense of distance, no understanding of direction, no recognition that something, somewhere, has already noticed you. Something that is not moving randomly, but deliberately, guided by a sense you do not possess. Closer and closer. There is no sound that warns you, no shadow that means anything, no signal that tells you to escape, only a presence, closing the distance with quiet precision, guided by the ability to perceive what you cannot. And then, suddenly, it ends. Not by accident, not by chance, but by intention. For the first time, death had a direction. From that moment on, survival was no longer passive. It became a race, a reaction, a constant negotiation between detection and escape. Because once even a single organism could see, every other organism was forced into a new reality. Adapt or disappear. The balance that had held life in a slow, stable rhythm for hundreds of millions of years began to fracture. What followed would not be gradual. It would not be subtle. It would become one of the most dramatic transformations the planet had ever experienced. A chain reaction that would reshape ecosystems, redefine survival, and drive life into forms more complex, more aggressive, and more aware than anything that had existed before. But at its origin, it all traces back to a moment so small it would have seemed insignificant. A moment when something, somewhere, developed the ability to detect light and then to interpret it. A moment when life did something it had never done before. It looked, and in doing so, it saw you. Long before anything learned to see, the earth was not empty. It was alive, but in a way that feels almost impossible to imagine now. The oceans were filled with organisms, spread across vast seafloors and shallow waters, forming one of the earliest complex ecosystems the planet had ever known. And yet, despite this abundance of life, something fundamental was missing. There was no awareness of distance, no recognition of being watched, no concept of elsewhere. Creatures existed in a world defined only by what they could touch. Their reality ended at the surface of their own bodies. Beyond that, there was no image, no outline, no hint that something might be approaching from afar. Movement existed, but it was not tracked. Contact happened, but it was not anticipated. Life, in this era, was not driven by fear. It was driven by presence. Many of these organisms drifted slowly across the seafloor, soft-bodied, fragile, and exposed. Forms like those found in the Ediacaran period, flat, leaf-like structures, simple tubular shapes, organisms that seem almost abstract compared to anything alive today. They had no shells, no armor, no visible means of defense. And more importantly, they had no reason to evolve them, because nothing was actively hunting them. Death, when it came, was not the result of pursuit. It was environmental, a shift in conditions, a lack of resources, a sudden burial under sediment, but not something choosing them, tracking them, closing in with intent. There was no need to hide, no need to run, no need to look over what would later become a shoulder. And without that pressure, life remained simple, stable. For millions upon millions of years, evolution moved slowly, almost reluctantly. There was no urgency forcing rapid change, no escalating competition that demanded new strategies, new structures, new forms of survival. Organisms adapted, but only as much as their environment required. And the environment in this silent world demanded very little. It is difficult to overstate how different this was from the world we know. Today, almost every movement is observed. Every signal, every color, every behavior exists in response to something watching. Survival is built on detection, seeing before being seen. But in this earlier time, that entire dynamic simply did not exist. Life was not trying to outsmart anything. It was not trying to escape anything. It was simply there. And because of that, the structure of ecosystems remained limited. Diversity existed, but within a narrow range of forms. Without the pressure of predation, there was no reason to develop speed or complex body plans or specialized defenses. The evolutionary landscape was flat, like a calm surface undisturbed by waves. But beneath that calm surface, something was beginning to change. Not in the organisms themselves, at least not at first, but in the conditions that surrounded them. Light had always been present, filtering down through the water, shifting with depth, scattering in complex patterns. For millions of years, it existed as an untapped source of information, a signal without a receiver, a dimension of reality that life simply ignored because it had no way to interpret it. But that would not remain true forever, because evolution does not need intention. It does not need foresight. It only needs variation. And somewhere within that vast population of simple organisms, small differences began to appear. Slight sensitivities to light, chemical reactions triggered by brightness, tiny shifts in behavior depending on whether an organism was in shadow or illumination. At first, these changes meant almost nothing. They did not create vision. They did not create awareness. But they introduced a new possibility, a way to interact with the environment that went beyond touch. And once that possibility existed, it could not be undone. Because even the smallest advantage, when repeated across millions of generations, begins to reshape the rules of survival. At this stage, the world was still quiet, still stable, still largely untouched by the kind of tension that defines life today. But the foundation had shifted. A new variable had entered the system. And systems do not remain stable when new variables are introduced. They begin to change, slowly at first, and then all at once. At first, nothing seemed different. The ocean still looked calm, still filled with the same slow-moving forms drifting across the seafloor. There were no sudden changes, no visible disruption, nothing to suggest that anything important had begun. But something had. A few organisms had started to respond to light, not seeing, not understanding, just reacting. When brightness shifted, they moved. When shadows passed, they adjusted. These were not choices, just chemical responses. Yet, even that was enough, because in a world where nothing could detect change before contact, the smallest difference became an advantage. And once an advantage exists, it spreads. At first, the effect was almost invisible. A slightly earlier reaction, a marginal shift in position, a tiny increase in survival that no single organism could notice. But evolution does not measure moments. It accumulates. Over time, those small differences began to stabilize. Cells that reacted to light became more specialized. Pigments formed, surfaces curved. The contrast between light and shadow became clearer, more reliable. And with that clarity came direction. Not vision, not yet, but enough to tell that something existed somewhere else. And that changed everything, because the moment an organism can detect direction, it can move with purpose. Not drifting, not waiting, but adjusting slightly, but deliberately. For the first time, there was a difference between reacting and anticipating. And that difference began to break the balance. The world was no longer completely neutral. Some organisms now had a slight advantage over others. They were not stronger or faster, but they were aware in the smallest possible way. And that awareness created a divide between those that could sense change and those that could not. At first, it wasn't dangerous. The gap was too small. Life continued as it always had, slow, quiet, stable. But evolution does not pause. Once a trait improves survival, pressure builds around it. Variations that enhance it are favored. Structures that support it become more defined. What begins as a simple reaction becomes something more precise. And once that happens, the system starts to shift, because light was no longer just part of the environment. It had become information, and information changes behavior. Organisms that could detect light began to position themselves differently. They adjusted, avoided, responded, not randomly, but with pattern. Slowly, the structure of interactions began to change. The calm surface of this world was still there, but underneath, the rules were no longer the same, because something had entered the system that would not remain passive. The ability to detect before being touched. At this stage, nothing truly had eyes, no images, no shapes, no clear perception. But the foundation was already in place, because sensing light leads to direction. Direction leads to movement, and movement leads to recognition. And once one organism can recognize another at a distance, everything changes, because it gains something no other organism has: choice. It can move toward or move away. And once that choice exists, intention follows. And once intention enters the system, the silence ends. It didn't happen all at once. There was no moment where the ocean suddenly filled with eyes, no single event that marked the beginning of vision as we understand it. Instead, it began the same way most transformations in evolution begin, quietly and almost invisibly. A small change. Somewhere within the genetic code of early organisms, a set of instructions began to shift. Not enough to create a perfect structure, not enough to produce a fully formed eye, but enough to organize cells in a new way to gather light, to process it, to respond with slightly more precision than before. At first, it was nothing remarkable, just a cluster of light-sensitive cells arranged differently, slightly more efficient, slightly more consistent, a variation that, on its own, would have seemed insignificant. But what makes this moment different is what happened next. Because this was not a one-time accident. The same pattern began to appear again and again, Across different organisms, separated by vast distances and evolutionary paths, nature kept arriving at a similar solution. It was as if the system itself was converging toward something inevitable, a structure that could take light and turn it into information. Scientists today would later identify a key part of this process, a genetic mechanism often referred to as PAX6, a kind of master switch capable of triggering the development of light-sensitive organs across very different species. What makes it unsettling is not just what it does, but how often it appears. From simple organisms to complex animals, variations of this same genetic instruction can be found, guiding the formation of eyes in ways that seem almost too consistent to be coincidence. Different designs, different structures, different levels of complexity, yet all linked by a shared foundation. It suggests something deeper. That vision was not just invented once. It was discovered, and once discovered, it kept returning, because the environment rewarded it. Every small improvement in detecting light created an advantage. Every increase in clarity, every gain in sensitivity, every refinement in structure gave its host a slightly better chance of survival. And those chances accumulated. Over time, the clusters of cells became more organized. Indentations formed, allowing light to be captured from specific directions. Surfaces curved, narrowing the field of input. The difference between brightness and shadow sharpened into something more defined. Edges, movement, contrast. Not a clear image, but enough to begin separating one object from another. And that was all evolution needed. Because once an organism can distinguish movement against a background, it no longer exists in isolation. It exists in relation to something else. Something that moves. Something that can be followed. At this stage, the world was still not filled with predators. There were no complex hunters yet, no high-speed chases or strategic attacks, but the foundation of those behaviors had already been established. Because vision, even in its earliest form, does not remain passive. It changes how organisms interact. It changes how they position themselves. And eventually, it changes what they do. The difference between sensing light and interpreting it is small at first, but that difference carries a consequence that would reshape life entirely. Because the moment light becomes information, information becomes advantage. And advantage in a system driven by survival is never neutral. It spreads. At some point, the change stopped being subtle. The structures that had once only detected light began to take on a new form. Shallow indentations deepened. Surfaces curved inward, narrowing the angle at which light could enter. What had once been a vague sensitivity began to focus, filtering information from a specific direction rather than from everywhere at once. And with that focus came clarity. Not perfect clarity, not yet, but enough to distinguish shapes, enough to separate movement from stillness, enough to recognize that something existed in a defined position rather than as a general presence. For the first time, an organism could do more than react. It could observe, and observation changed behavior. Because once an organism can detect movement at a distance, it gains time. Time to adjust, time to position itself, time to choose. That time, even measured in fractions of a second, was enough to shift the balance. Some organisms began to avoid contact more effectively. They adjusted their position when something moved toward them. They drifted away from disturbances before those disturbances reached them. These were small changes, but they accumulated, and over time, they created a noticeable difference in survival. But avoidance is only one side of the equation, because the same ability that allows something to escape can also be used to approach. And that is where everything changed. Some organisms did not use this emerging sense to retreat. They used it to move closer. At first, this would not have looked like hunting. There were no sudden attacks, no bursts of speed, no clear signs of predation as we understand it today. But the behavior had shifted. Movement was no longer random. It was guided, directed. An organism could now orient itself towards something that was already in motion. It could follow, even if only loosely. It could maintain proximity, adjusting its path based on changes in position, not perfectly, but consistently enough to matter. And once that pattern exists, it does not remain simple, because evolution refines what works. Structures that improved directional sensing became more defined. The curvature of light-sensitive surfaces increased, narrowing input further. Pigments deepened, enhancing contrast. Neural pathways began to form, linking detection with response more efficiently. What had once been a passive system was becoming active, responsive, adaptive, and slowly, without any single defining moment, it crossed another threshold, from sensing to tracking. That transition is subtle, but its consequences are not. Because the moment an organism can track another, it gains control over distance. It can reduce the gap. It can maintain alignment. It can follow. And following leads, inevitably, to contact that is no longer accidental. At this stage, the world had not yet erupted into the violent competition that would later define it. But the foundation of that violence had been laid. The ability to see, even imperfectly, had introduced a new kind of interaction. One based on intention. One based on choice. And once those elements exist, behavior begins to shift. Some organisms began to position themselves where others were more likely to pass. They lingered in areas of movement. They adjusted their orientation to remain aligned with drifting forms. What had once been a passive existence was becoming strategic, even if only in the simplest sense. And strategy changes everything. Because once an organism begins to act based on what it perceives, it is no longer reacting to the world. It is shaping its interaction with it. At this point, nothing resembled the complex predators we know today. There were no sharp teeth, no rapid chases, no sudden bursts of coordinated attack. But the system that would eventually produce those behaviors was already in motion. Because vision does not remain neutral. It amplifies difference. Organisms that could interpret light more effectively gained more control. More control led to better positioning. Better positioning led to increased contact under favorable conditions. And over time, that contact became less random, more selective, more intentional. What had once been a quiet, stable environment was now shifting towards something else entirely. Not chaos. Not yet. But tension. A tension built on the simple fact that some organisms could now perceive others before those others could perceive them in return. And that imbalance cannot persist without consequence. Because once one organism can see and another cannot, the outcome is no longer uncertain. It is only delayed. And in that delay, evolution finds its next step. Because the next transformation would not just refine vision, it would weaponize it. At first, the difference was subtle. The organisms that could detect movement were already gaining an advantage. They could follow, adjust, remain aligned with something in motion. But what they lacked was clarity. They could sense that something was there, but not what it was. That limitation did not last. Because once evolution discovers a useful pathway, it does not stop refining it. It pushes forward, gradually improving every component that contributes to survival. And in the case of vision, that meant one thing. Sharpening the image, light-sensitive surfaces became more structured. Instead of capturing light from all directions, they began to restrict it, filtering input through narrower openings. Curved depressions deepened further, allowing organisms to distinguish not just movement, but direction with greater precision. And then, something even more significant began to appear. Surfaces that could focus light. Primitive lenses, not perfect, not clear in the way modern eyes function, but enough to bring a rough image into alignment. Enough to turn scattered light into something organized. Something readable. For the first time, an organism could begin to perceive shapes. Not detailed forms, not colors, but outlines, edges, boundaries between one thing and another. And that changed the nature of interaction completely. Because once you can see a boundary, you can identify an object. And once you can identify an object, you can treat it differently from everything else. This was no longer just sensing. It was recognition. The ocean, once an indistinct field of movement and contact, was beginning to separate into parts, individual forms, distinct entities. One, things that could be approached, avoided, or followed with greater accuracy. Among the earliest creatures to develop this level of vision were organisms we now know as trilobites. At a glance, they might seem simple. Flattened bodies, segmented shells, slow movement across the seafloor, but their eyes tell a different story. Complex, compound structures made of multiple lenses, arranged in patterns that allowed them to detect light from various angles. Not perfect vision, but far more advanced than anything that had existed before. And more importantly, reliable. They could track movement with greater precision, they could distinguish shapes more clearly, they could respond not just to the presence of something, but to its form. And that reliability gave them something new, confidence. Because once an organism can depend on its perception, it begins to act differently. It no longer hesitates in the same way. It no longer moves blindly. It begins to navigate its environment with intention. But that intention does not remain neutral, because recognition changes behavior in ways that go beyond avoidance. If you can identify something as separate, you can also identify it as useful, or as a threat, or as something that can be approached. At this stage, the shift was still gradual. Trilobites and other early organisms with developed eyes were not yet the dominant predators of their world, but they had crossed a threshold that others had not. They could see clearly enough to make distinctions. And in a system where most organisms were still limited in their perception, that distinction created imbalance. Because the moment one organism can interpret its environment more accurately than another, it gains control. Control over movement, control over positioning, control over interaction. And once control exists, the outcome is no longer random. The ocean was still not the violent place it would later become. There were no rapid pursuits, no complex hunting strategies, no high-speed chases across open water. But something had changed at a deeper level. Interactions were no longer equal. Some organisms now had the ability to perceive others in ways that those others could not return. And that asymmetry is where every predator-prey relationship begins. Because when one organism sees more, it does more. And what it does next will define everything that follows. Clarity did not stay passive. Once vision became reliable, behavior began to shift. Not suddenly, not everywhere at once, but in small, consistent ways that slowly changed how organisms moved, positioned themselves, and interacted with everything around them. Before this point, movement had been largely indifferent. Creatures drifted, crawled, or settled without reacting to anything beyond immediate contact. But now, some organisms could see enough to make adjustments before contact happened. They could avoid, they could align, and eventually, they could approach. At first, this change was subtle. An organism might turn slightly toward movement instead of away from it. It might remain in areas where other forms passed more frequently. It might adjust its position to stay within range of something it had already detected. Not hunting, not yet, but no longer random. And that distinction is where everything begins. Because once movement becomes guided, it becomes repeatable. And once it is repeatable, it becomes something evolution can refine. Organisms that could maintain alignment with moving targets gained more consistent contact, not by chance, but by following patterns. And over time, that consistency began to matter. Some interactions happened more often. Some organisms encountered others more frequently than the rest. And in a system driven by survival, frequency becomes opportunity. At this stage, there were still no specialized predators in the way we would recognize them today. No dedicated hunting structures, no high-speed pursuit, no complex strategies. But the behavior that would eventually define those traits had already begun to take shape, because the key element was no longer missing. Direction. Once an organism can see where something is and continue moving toward it, the gap between passive contact and active pursuit becomes very small, and that gap was closing. Slowly, but inevitably, the organisms with better vision began to control distance more effectively. They could reduce the space between themselves and others. They could remain aligned as that distance changed. They could correct their movement again and again, keeping something within reach. Not perfectly, but consistently, and consistency is enough. Because evolution does not require perfection. it only requires advantage. What started as a simple ability to distinguish light had now become something far more powerful, a way to influence interaction itself, and interaction is where survival is decided. The ocean was no longer a place where contact happened by accident alone. For some organisms, contact was becoming predictable, expected, and once something becomes predictable, it can be exploited. At this point, the balance had already been broken. Not dramatically, not visibly, but fundamentally. Some organisms could now see well enough to shape their encounters. Others still could not. And that difference was no longer neutral. Because once one organism can control distance and another cannot, the outcome begins to shift. Not always, not immediately, but often enough to matter. The first true predators had not fully emerged yet, but the world was already preparing for them because vision had crossed another threshold. It was no longer just a way to interpret the environment. It had become a way to influence it. And once that happens, it does not stop because the next step is inevitable, from following to targeting, from targeting to attacking. And when that transition completes, the ocean will no longer be quiet. At some point, the pattern changed. Following was no longer enough. The organisms that could track movement had already gained an advantage. They could align, maintain distance, and encounter others more consistently than before. But evolution does not reward stability. It rewards escalation, and escalation had begun. Some organisms started to move differently, not just adjusting their position, not just drifting into contact, but actively closing the distance between themselves and something else. The movement was subtle at first, almost indistinguishable from what came before, but the intent behind it had shifted. They were no longer just reacting, they were approaching. That difference, small as it seemed, marked the beginning of something entirely new. Because once an organism begins to move toward another with consistency, it is no longer part of a passive system. It is part of a pursuit. At first, these early pursuits were inefficient. The organisms involved were not fast. They were not specialized. Their movements were slow, their coordination limited, but they did not need to be perfect. They only needed to be slightly better than random. And that was enough. Because the organisms being approached still lived in a world that had not fully changed. Many of them could not see clearly. Some could not detect direction at all. They were still drifting, still reacting only upon contact, still unaware that something had already begun moving toward them. That imbalance created opportunity. An organism that could detect, align, and continue moving in the same direction as its target would encounter it more often than chance alone would allow. And over time, those encounters became more consistent, more reliable, and eventually, more controlled. At this stage, the ocean still did not resemble the violent ecosystems we see today. There were no rapid chases across open water, no explosive bursts of speed, no clear dominance of one species over another, but the foundation of all those behaviors had already been established. Because the key element was no longer missing. Eintent. Once movement is guided by perception, and perception is used to reduce distance, behavior becomes directional. And once it becomes directional, it begins to resemble something else entirely. Something deliberate. And that is what defines a hunter. Not speed, not strength, but purpose. The ability to move towards something because it has been identified as a target. At this point, no organism had perfected that ability, but some had begun to express it. Their movements were no longer neutral. They were biased, oriented toward interaction rather than avoidance. And evolution noticed because any behavior that increases the frequency of successful contact increases survival. And survival shapes everything. Over time, those early forms of pursuit began to refine. Organisms that could maintain alignment longer gained more consistent results. Those that could adjust more precisely reduced the chance of losing contact. Each small improvement added to the system, building towards something more efficient, more controlled, more dangerous. And as this process continued, the balance between organisms shifted further. Because once one organism can approach effectively, and another cannot detect that approach in time, the outcome becomes predictable. Not always, but often enough to matter. And in evolution, often enough is all it takes. The ocean had changed, not on the surface, but in the way interactions unfolded beneath it. Contact was no longer purely accidental. It was becoming intentional. And once that line is crossed, it cannot be undone, because the next step is inevitable. Organisms will not just approach. They will optimize that approach. They will refine it. They will build around it. And when they do, the first true predators will emerge. It did not begin with speed. It did not begin with strength. It began with precision. Somewhere in the Cambrian Ocean, an organism appeared that did more than follow. It did more than align. It did more than simply reduce distance. It began to control the moment of contact. Among the earliest of these forms was a creature unlike anything that had existed before, Anomalocaris. At a glance, it did not seem like a perfect hunter. Its body was soft, its movement fluid, almost unfamiliar compared to modern predators. But what defined it was not its shape. It was what it could do. Its eyes were unlike anything that had come before. Large, compound, capable of detecting movement with remarkable accuracy. Not just light, not just direction, movement. And with that ability, it gained something no organism had fully possessed before: control over timing. Because once you can track something clearly, you can decide when to act. Not before, not after, but at the exact moment it matters. Anomalocaris did not drift into contact. It closed in, slowly at first, maintaining alignment, adjusting its position as its target moved. Its vision allowed it to stay oriented, to correct its path, to remain within range even as conditions shifted. And then it acted, not randomly, not by chance, but deliberately. This is the moment where pursuit becomes hunting, because hunting is not just movement toward a target. It is movement timed for success. The difference is small in appearance, but enormous in consequence. Organisms that could only react were now facing something that could predict, something that could follow long enough to ensure contact, something that could choose the moment, and that difference changed the outcome. For the first time, an organism was not just encountering others more often, it was capturing them more often. Not always, but often enough, and often enough is all evolution requires. Because once a behavior increases success, it is reinforced. Structures that support it become more defined. Systems that improve it become more complex. Over time, what began as a crude advantage becomes a dominant strategy. Anomalocaris did not need to be perfect. It only needed to be better than everything around it. And it was. Its vision allowed it to track targets others could not follow. Its movement allowed it to maintain pressure. Its behavior allowed it to convert proximity into contact with greater consistency. And that was enough to shift the balance. Because once one organism can hunt effectively, everything else must change. Prey can no longer drift without consequence. They can no longer rely on randomness to survive. They must respond. They must adapt. And that is when the system transforms. Because the emergence of a true hunter does not just affect one species. It affects all of them. Every organism now exists under a new pressure. Not just to survive the environment, but to survive being seen. And that pressure does not remain static. It escalates. Because as predators improve, prey must improve. And as prey improves, predators must respond. What began as a single advantage now becomes a feedback loop, a cycle of adaptation and counter-adaptation that drives change at a speed the world had never experienced before. The quiet ocean was gone. In its place, something else had begun. A system defined not by stability, but by conflict. And at the center of that conflict was vision. The moment hunting became reliable, the world changed again. Not slowly, not quietly, but everywhere at once. Because a successful predator does not just survive, it forces everything around it to respond. Every organism that had once drifted without urgency was now exposed to something that could see, track, and act with intention. And that changed the rules. For the first time, Survival was no longer about enduring the environment. It was about avoiding something that wanted to find you. At first, the response was simple: movement. Organisms that could move away faster had a better chance of surviving. Even a slight increase in speed created distance, and distance meant time. Time to escape, time to avoid contact before it became unavoidable. But speed alone was not enough, because predators adapted too. They improved their tracking, they maintained alignment longer, they reduced the advantage that speed alone could provide, and as that happened, prey were forced to change again. This is where structure began to matter. Bodies that had once been soft and exposed started to shift. Outer layers thickened, surfaces hardened. The first primitive forms of protection began to appear, not perfect armor, not complete defense, but enough to make a difference. Enough to survive contact, sometimes. And sometimes is all evolution needs, because each survival event reinforces the trait that made it possible. Over generations, those traits become more defined, more reliable, more effective. Soft bodies became harder, flat forms became segmented. Simple shapes became more complex, not for efficiency, not for beauty, but for survival. At the same time, other strategies began to emerge. Some organisms developed spines, extending outward from their bodies, not to attack, but to make themselves more difficult to consume, to increase the cost of being targeted, to force predators to reconsider. Others changed their behavior. They burrowed into sediment, disappearing from open space. They reduced their visibility, minimized movement, stayed within environments where detection was more difficult. Avoidance became a strategy, but avoidance has limits, because vision does not remain static. As prey hid, predators improved their ability to detect them. As bodies hardened, predators adapted their methods of contact. As movement increased, predators refined their tracking. Each change triggered another. Each advantage created a counter. And that is what defines an arms race. Not a single adaptation, but a cycle. A continuous exchange where no side can stop improving without falling behind. At this stage, the ocean was no longer stable. Every organism was under pressure, not just to survive, but to keep up. Because once a system becomes competitive at this level, standing still is no longer neutral. It is failure. And failure in evolution does not persist. It disappears. The diversity of life began to increase, not because conditions had become more favorable, but because they had become more demanding. New forms appeared, each representing a different solution to the same problem. How do you survive in a world where something can see you before you can see it? There was no single answer. So evolution tried many, and in doing so, it accelerated, faster than ever before. The quiet ocean of the past had become something else entirely. A system in motion, driven not by stability, but by pressure. And that pressure would not slow down, because the more vision improved, the more everything else had to change. The changes did not slow down. They compounded. Each small advantage triggered a response, and each response forced another adjustment. What had begun as a simple difference in perception was now driving a cascade of changes across the entire ecosystem. Speed increased. Organisms that could move even slightly faster created distance that mattered. That distance disrupted alignment, broke tracking, reduced the chance of contact. For a moment, it worked, but only for a moment, because predators adapted. They refined how they followed. They adjusted their movement, reduced wasted motion, maintained direction more effectively. Speed alone was no longer enough. It had to be combined with awareness, with timing, with control, and so prey adapted again. Movement became more complex. Instead of drifting or moving in predictable paths, some organisms began to change direction more frequently. Irregular motion reduced the effectiveness of tracking. It introduced uncertainty into the system. But uncertainty also has limits. Because vision continued to improve, the ability to distinguish movement patterns became sharper. The ability to maintain alignment despite variation became more reliable. Each improvement narrowed the advantage that prey had gained. And as that happened, the pressure increased, not just on movement, but on form. Bodies continued to change. Segmentation became more pronounced, allowing flexibility without losing protection. Outer layers thickened further, resisting damage more effectively. Some organisms reduced their profile, becoming harder to detect. Others expanded outward, increasing their size to discourage attack. Different strategies. Same problem. Survival under observation. At the same time, sensory systems continued to develop. Vision became clearer, more precise, more consistent. The difference between object and background sharpened. The ability to detect movement at greater distances improved. The gap between those who could see and those who could not widened. And that gap drove everything forward. Because in a system where one side improves perception faster than the other can respond, the outcome accelerates. Interactions became more frequent, encounters became more controlled, contact became less random, and with that, the structure of the ecosystem began to reorganize. This was no longer a collection of independent organisms drifting through the same space. It was a network of interactions. Predators influencing prey, prey influencing predators, each shaping the evolution of the other. And as those interactions intensified, diversity increased. Not gradually, but rapidly. New forms appeared, each representing a different response to the same escalating pressure. Some focused on speed, others on protection, others on avoidance or concealment. There was no single solution, so evolution explored many. And that exploration created something unprecedented. A sudden expansion in complexity, a surge in variation, a system that was no longer stable, but dynamic. And this is where the shift becomes visible. Because what had been building beneath the surface, this constant cycle of adaptation and counter-adaptation, began to manifest in the fossil record as something dramatic. Something that, at first glance, appears almost impossible. A sudden explosion of life. But it was not sudden. And it was not random. It was the result of pressure. Accumulated, amplified, and finally released. Because once vision entered the system and began to drive interaction, evolution did not just continue, it accelerated beyond anything that had come before. And what followed would be remembered as one of the most important transitions in the history of life. From the outside, it looks sudden. In the fossil record, something changes with a speed that seems almost impossible. For hundreds of millions of years, life remained relatively simple. Then, within a comparatively short window of time, complexity appears everywhere. New body plans, new structures, new ways of moving, protecting, sensing. It is often called the Cambrian explosion. And at first glance, it feels like a mystery, as if life suddenly decided to become more complex. But nothing in evolution happens without pressure. And by this point, the pressure had been building for a very long time. Because what we are seeing here is not the beginning of change. It is the moment that change becomes visible. For millions of years, organisms had been adapting to a new reality, a world where vision existed, where detection happened at a distance, where movement could be tracked, where interaction was no longer random. Each small adjustment had added to the system. Each response had triggered another. And eventually, those changes reached a threshold. A point where the system could no longer remain stable. And when stability breaks, expansion follows. That expansion is what we see in the Cambrian period, not as a sudden creation, but as a release of possibilities that had been constrained by a simpler world. Because once organisms must respond to being seen, the number of viable strategies increases dramatically. You can become faster, you can become harder, you can become more complex. You can hide, you can burrow, you can develop structures that confuse, deflect, or discourage attack. Each of these paths leads to a different form, and each form adds to the diversity of the system. This is why the Cambrian explosion appears so dramatic, not because life suddenly changed direction, but because it was forced to explore many directions at once, driven by a single underlying cause, interaction. And at the center of that interaction, vision, because vision transforms the environment into information. And once information exists, behavior changes. And once behavior changes, evolution accelerates. The ocean was no longer a passive space. It had become a field of signals. Movement meant something. Shape meant something. Position meant something. Every organism was now part of a system where being detected carried consequences. And those consequences drove innovation. Structures that had never existed before began to appear. Limbs designed for movement, surfaces designed for protection, sensory systems designed for detection, not as isolated developments, but as interconnected responses to the same pressure, and that pressure did not weaken. It intensified, because every new adaptation created a new challenge. Every improvement on one side forced a response on the other. The system fed itself, and as it did, complexity increased, rapidly, relentlessly, until the ocean was no longer recognizable as the quiet world it had once been. It had become something else, a dynamic, competitive environment where survival depended not just on existing, but on responding to movement, responding to presence, responding to being seen. And once that process begins, it does not stop. What followed was not balance, it was escalation. As new forms appeared, each solving the problem of survival in a different way, the system became more crowded, more complex, and more unstable. Every strategy that worked in one moment created a new vulnerability in the mundo. Speed made you visible. Armor made you slower. Hiding reduced risk, but limited movement. There was no perfect solution, only trade-offs. And in a world driven by detection, every trade-off mattered, because being seen was no longer rare. It was constant. The ocean had transformed into a space where presence could not be ignored. Movement drew attention. Stillness became a strategy. Shape became a signal. Every organism, whether it intended to or not, was now communicating information simply by existing, and that information could be used against it. This is what makes the Cambrian period so different from everything that came before. Not just the number of species, not just the variety of forms, but the intensity of interaction between them. Every organism was now part of a network, a system where actions had consequences beyond immediate contact, where movement could trigger a response, where detection could lead to pursuit, and where survival depended on how well you managed that relationship. For some, the solution was to disappear, burrowing deeper into sediment, reducing exposure, minimizing movement. These organisms traded awareness for concealment, sacrificing the ability to respond in exchange for a lower chance of being detected at all. For others, the solution was to resist. Thicker shells, stronger outer layers, structures designed not to prevent contact, but to survive it. They accepted that they would be found and adapted to endure what followed. And then there were those that adapted to exploit the system directly, improving perception, refining movement, increasing control over interaction. These organisms did not avoid the pressure. They used it, and in doing so, they pushed the system even further, because every improvement in detection increased the effectiveness of pursuit. Every improvement in pursuit increased the pressure on prey, and every increase in pressure forced new adaptations in return. The cycle fed itself, faster, stronger, more complex, until the system reached a point where stillness was no longer safe. Because even if you did not move, something else could. Even if you hid, something could find you. Even if you endured, something could adapt around you. There was no longer a place in the ocean where an organism could exist without consequence, because the environment itself had changed. Not physically, but functionally, it had become a space defined by observation, and observation changes everything. Because once you are part of a system where you can be seen at any moment, your entire existence becomes a response to that possibility. And that is what drove the next transformation. Because as powerful as vision had become in the ocean, it was about to enter a new environment, one where light was stronger, clearer, more direct, and far less forgiving. The surface, and beyond it, land. For millions of years, vision evolved in water, a filtered world. Light scattered, softened, diffused across layers of depth. Shapes were never perfectly sharp. Distance was never completely clear. Even the most advanced eyes of the time were working within limits imposed by the medium itself. Water hid things. It blurred edges. It reduced contrast. And because of that, it offered a kind of protection, not complete safety, but uncertainty. But that uncertainty did not exist everywhere. At the surface, conditions were different. Light was stronger, more direct, less distorted. And beyond that surface was an environment where those differences became absolute. Air. The moment organisms began to move toward shallower waters, and eventually beyond them, vision entered a space it had never encountered before. A space where light traveled differently, where clarity increased dramatically, where the distance between objects could be perceived with far greater precision. At first, this transition was limited. Small movements, temporary exposure, organisms venturing into new zones without fully leaving the environment they had evolved in. But even those brief encounters revealed something important. Vision worked better here. Shapes were clearer. Movement was easier to track. Contrast was sharper. And with that improvement came a new level of risk, because the same clarity that allowed an organism to see further allowed it to be seen from further away. Distance, which had once provided a margin of safety, became less reliable. Movement, which had once blended into the environment, became more visible. The balance between detection and concealment shifted again. And once again, organisms had to adapt. Eyes that had evolved for water were no longer optimal. The way light bent, the way it entered the eye, the way it focused, all of it changed. Structures had to adjust. Surfaces had to refine. New solutions had to emerge to handle a world where clarity was no longer limited. This was not a simple improvement. It was a transformation, because increased clarity does not just make vision better. It makes interaction faster. Decisions that once took time could now be made almost instantly. Movement could be tracked over longer distances. Targets could be identified earlier. Responses could be triggered sooner. Everything accelerated. And acceleration increases pressure, because when detection happens sooner, reaction must happen sooner. When tracking improves, escape becomes harder. When clarity increases, mistakes become more costly. The environment was no longer forgiving. It demanded precision. And in a system where precision determines survival, even the smallest error becomes significant. At this stage, the transition to land was not yet complete, but the conditions that would define it were already in place. Vision had entered a new phase 1 where its effectiveness was no longer limited by the medium, but by the organism itself. And that meant evolution had a new direction, not just improving the ability to see, but optimizing it for a world where being seen was unavoidable, because in this new environment, hiding was harder. Distance was less protective, and light revealed everything. The ocean had forced organisms to adapt to being detected, but this new world would make detection inevitable. Clarity came at a cost. As vision improved in this new environment, organisms were forced to change not just how they saw, but how they existed. The structures that once worked in water were no longer enough. Light behaved differently here. It did not scatter in the same way. It did not soften edges or reduce contrast. It exposed, and exposure demands adjustment. Eyes began to evolve again, this time to handle a world where precision mattered more than ever. Surfaces that had once gathered light broadly now needed to focus it more accurately. Lenses became more refined, better able to direct light to specific points. The ability to form clearer images improved, not gradually, but under pressure, because in a world where everything could be seen more easily, the margin for error became smaller. A delay in response, a misjudgment in distance, a moment of hesitation, each carried consequences that could no longer be ignored. And so behavior changed. Organisms could no longer rely on stillness alone. Remaining motionless might reduce attention, but it could not guarantee safety. In clearer light, even subtle forms could be detected. Shape itself became a signal. Movement had to be controlled. T-med, intentional. Some organisms adapted by becoming more precise in how they moved. Instead of constant motion, they shifted to short, calculated bursts. Quick adjustments followed by stillness. a pattern designed to reduce predictability while maintaining control. Others adapted through structure. Bodies changed in ways that altered how they interacted with light. Surfaces broke up outlines. Forms became less distinct against the background. The goal was no longer just to survive contact, but to delay detection, to exist without being recognized. But recognition was becoming harder to avoid, because vision in this environment was not just clearer. It was more informative. Depth became easier to judge, distance more reliable, movement more distinct. Organisms could interpret their surroundings with a level of detail that had never been possible before. And that detail changed decisions. Predators could identify targets earlier. They could track more accurately. They could adjust their approach with greater precision. The gap between detection and action narrowed. Prey, in response, had to react faster, not just physically, but perceptually. They needed to interpret signals quickly, to distinguish between harmless movement and immediate threat, to respond before the advantage shifted entirely. And this is where the system becomes even more complex, because once perception improves, the world itself begins to fragment. Different organisms do not see the same environment. Some detect wavelengths, others cannot. Some perceive contrast in ways that reveal patterns invisible to others. Some respond to movement at speeds that others cannot process. Reality, as experienced by each organism, begins to diverge. And that divergence creates new strategies, because what is hidden to one may be visible to another. What appears still may be moving. What seems safe may already be exposed. The environment was no longer a shared experience. It had become multiple overlapping realities, and survival depended on which version of that reality you could access. The shift that began in the ocean, the transformation driven by vision, had now expanded into something far more complex. Not just a system of detection and response, but a system of perception itself. And once perception becomes variable, the rules of survival are no longer fixed. They depend on what you can see and what you cannot. By this point, vision had already transformed the structure of life. But something far more unsettling was beginning to emerge. Not just better sight, but different sight. Because as visual systems evolved, they did not move toward a single perfect form. They split, they diverged. They adapted in different directions, shaped by different pressures, different environments, and different survival strategies. And as they diverged, the world itself began to fragment. Not physically, but perceptually, because not all organisms see the same reality. The environment remains constant, but perception does not. What appears obvious to one organism may be completely invisible to another. What seems uniform from one perspective may be filled with patterns from another. What looks still may be alive with motion. Reality, in this system, is not shared. It is constructed. Some organisms evolved to detect wavelengths far beyond what others could perceive. Light that falls outside the narrow band of human vision became part of their world. Ultraviolet signals, hidden within surfaces, revealed structures that most eyes could never register. To those organisms, nothing was plain. Surfaces carried markings. Paths were visible. Boundaries existed where others saw none. The environment was no longer just space. It was information, encoded in light, invisible to most, but critical to those who could detect it. For others, clarity itself was not the priority. Their vision evolved toward sensitivity, not to understand detail, but to detect change. A slight shift in position, a disruption in pattern, a movement that breaks stillness. That was enough. Because in a system where survival depends on reacting before contact, detecting motion is often more valuable than seeing clearly. Understanding can wait. Reaction cannot. Other organisms evolved in yet another direction. Depth, distance, spatial awareness. They began to interpret the environment in layers. Objects were no longer just present, they existed at measurable positions. Movement could be tracked across space. Paths could be predicted before they unfolded. This created something new, control, the ability to move not just in response, but with intention, faster, more precise. more effective. Each of these systems created a different version of the same world, not a different environment, but a different reality, and that difference carries consequences. Because survival does not depend on what exists, it depends on what can be perceived. An organism that cannot detect a signal does not respond to it. A threat that cannot be seen does not trigger action. A pattern that cannot be recognized might as well not exist at all. And in a system where perception varies, so does vulnerability. What is hidden to one organism may be completely exposed to another. What appears safe from one perspective may be highly dangerous from another. There is no single, stable version of the world. No universal truth that all organisms share. Only overlapping interpretations. Fragments of reality, shaped by the limits of perception. And each fragment is incomplete, because every visual system, no matter how advanced, is built around one principle. Not accuracy, but usefulness. It does not show everything. It shows what matters for survival, and nothing more. Which means that even at this stage, with vision more advanced than ever before, life was not seeing the world as it truly was. It was seeing only what it needed to survive. And everything beyond that remained hidden. If vision defines reality, then reality has limits. Not because the world itself is limited, but because perception is. Every visual system, no matter how refined, is constrained. It detects only certain signals. It processes information in specific ways. It prioritizes what matters for survival and ignores what does not. Nothing sees everything. Nothing ever will. This creates a boundary, a line between what is visible and what is not. And everything beyond that line effectively disappears. Not because it does not exist, but because it cannot be perceived, which means every organism is navigating an incomplete version of the world, a version shaped not by truth, but by function, by what increases survival, by what allows faster reaction, by what improves control over interaction, and that version is never complete. Even now, even at the highest levels of biological complexity, vision does not reveal the world as it is. It reveals the world as it needs to be seen. This is why different organisms can exist within the same environment and yet experience entirely different conditions. They are not reacting to the same signals. They are not interpreting the same patterns. They are not facing the same risks. They are living in parallel realities, interacting but never fully understanding. And that creates instability, because advantage is never fixed. An organism that evolves to hide within one spectrum may become highly visible in another. A structure that reduces detection under one condition may amplify it under another. A behavior that works in one environment may fail completely when conditions shift. There is no permanent solution, only temporary advantages. And those advantages do not last, because the system does not stop. It continues to change, relentlessly, as environments shift, as interactions evolve, as new forms emerge. The balance between perception and survival is constantly rewritten. What once provided safety becomes a weakness. What once revealed danger becomes irrelevant. What once worked stops working and must be replaced. This is the true limitation of vision. Not that it fails to show everything, but that it creates dependence. Because once an organism relies on what it can see, it becomes vulnerable to what it cannot. And that vulnerability cannot be eliminated, only managed, which means that no matter how advanced perception becomes, there will always be something beyond it, something undetected, something unaccounted for, something that exists outside the system of awareness. And that is where uncertainty remains, not in what is visible, but in what is hidden, because whatever lies beyond perception still exists. It still shapes interactions. It still influences outcomes, even if nothing is aware of it. And that creates a paradox. The more precisely an organism sees, the more it depends on that precision. And the more it depends on that precision, the more dangerous its limits become. Because errors are no longer random. They are systemic. They arise not from chaos, but from blind spots, from things that cannot be seen, which means that no matter how advanced vision becomes, it never resolves the problem of survival. It only changes its form. It replaces uncertainty with a different kind of uncertainty, a more structured one, a more predictable one, but still incomplete. And because it is incomplete, the system continues, adapting, responding, evolving again and again and again, which leads to a final realization, not about what organisms can see, but about what they never will. Because if every organism experiences only a fragment of reality, then no organism ever truly understands the system it exists within. It only reacts to it. And if that is true, then everything that has evolved from the first light-sensitive cells to the most advanced visual systems is not a progression toward truth, but a progression toward survival, toward usefulness, toward what works for now. And everything else remains unseen. At some point, the question changes. It is no longer about how vision evolved, but about what it did to the world once it appeared. Because everything that followed every predator, every escape, every adaptation can be traced back to a single moment. The moment life began to see. Before that moment, the world was limited, simple, slow, but it was also quiet. There was no need to anticipate, no need to interpret movement at a distance, no need to react before something happened. Life existed entirely within the present, confined to what could be touched, what could be felt, what could be directly experienced. Nothing more and nothing less. There was no tension in the distance, no threat forming beyond reach, no sense that something, somewhere, had already noticed you. Then vision appeared, and the present was no longer enough, because the moment you can see, you begin to imagine what comes next. Detection creates expectation. Expectation creates reaction, and reaction creates pressure. At first, that pressure seems like progress, an increase in awareness, a refinement of survival, a step towards something more advanced. But every step forward came with a cost, because the moment one organism could see, others had to respond. The moment tracking became possible, escape became necessary. The moment clarity increased, hiding became harder. Each improvement created imbalance. Each imbalance demanded correction, and that correction created something new, a system that could no longer remain still. Predators improve, prey adapt, perception sharpens, strategies evolve, and then it happens again, faster, more precisely, more relentlessly. There is no final state, no moment where the system settles, no point where survival becomes stable again, because vision does not solve the problem of survival. It transforms it into something continuous, something self-sustaining, something that feeds on its own momentum. Every organism now exists in a world where it can be seen, where movement carries meaning, where presence creates risk, where even stillness is a decision, not a default. There is no longer a place where life simply exists without consequence, because once detection becomes possible, everything becomes interaction, and interaction creates tension. That tension spreads across species, across environments, across time, until it becomes the defining force of the system itself. And once that happens, there is no return, because vision does not disappear. It expands, it refines, it dominates, until every structure, every behavior, every instinct is shaped by it. Even now, the system continues, not just in oceans, not just on land, but in everything that has followed, because the same pattern remains. Detect, interpret, act. And the faster those steps become, the more pressure they create. We have extended vision beyond biology. We have amplified it, recreated it. Machines now see patterns we cannot. Systems detect signals beyond human perception. Information moves faster than any organism can respond. We are no longer just part of the system. We are accelerating it, and that introduces something new. Not just adaptation, but control. Because once you can see more, you can act sooner. And once you can act sooner, you can shape outcomes before they happen. at a scale evolution never reached. And that raises a possibility that is difficult to ignore, that what began as a simple response to light has become something far more powerful, not just a tool for survival, but a force that reshapes the system itself. Because in a world built on perception, control belongs to those who see first. So the question is no longer about the past. It is about the nature of the system we now exist within. A system where nothing is ever fully hidden, where every advantage creates another imbalance, where every imbalance demands another response, where every organism, no matter how advanced, is still reacting to something it cannot fully control. Because if every organism must respond to being seen, then no organism is ever truly still. And if nothing is ever truly still, then the system never ends. It only continues, adapting, responding, escalating, again and again and again. And if that is true, then the moment life learned to see may not have been the beginning of understanding. It may have been the beginning of something else entirely, a system that can never return to silence,